The torches had been burning for 3 hours, and Wren was still standing on the platform. That was the part that humiliated her most. Not the cold, not the gown they'd laced too tightly across her ribs until every breath was a negotiation. Not even the way the crowd below watched her with the detached curiosity one might give a wounded animal at the roadside. It was the duration. The endless, grinding duration of it. One by one, the other girls had been claimed. Alara, with her river-dark hair and her soft omega scent, gone within the first hour. The twins from the northern settlement, gone before the second. Even quiet Mira, who stuttered when she was nervous and smelled faintly of ash and lavender, had been led from the platform by a broad-shouldered beta who'd pressed his lips to her temple with something that almost resembled tenderness. And then there was Wren, still standing. The mating sale of Velhorn was not a gentle tradition, and it had never pretended to be. Every year, when the autumn moon crested the ridgeline and the pack's unmated omegas came of age, the elders gathered them beneath the great hall's torches and let the pack's alphas and betas choose. It was called a sale only because coin exchanged hands. For the dowry, the elders always said, for the security, for the order of the pack hierarchy. But Wren had grown up watching it from the outside, from the cold edge of the crowd where orphans stood, and she had always known what it truly was. It was judgment. And tonight, she was being judged. And found wanting. The murmur passing through the remaining spectators was not unkind precisely. It was simply honest. She could hear fragments of it drifting upward like smoke. Too thin, someone said. Her mother was half feral, and the one that followed her everywhere. The one she had heard so often it had carved itself into her bones like a cold brand. Something is wrong with her scent. Not broken, not absent, just wrong. As if whatever omega sweetness should have bloomed in her had curdled at the root. The handler, a narrow-faced man called Aldrich who smelled of pipe smoke and poorly concealed irritation, climbed 3 steps of the platform and muttered at her without quite meeting her eyes. "Lower your chin. Smile. You look like you're waiting to be executed." She considered telling him that was because she felt like she was waiting to be executed. Instead, she lowered her chin and arranged her face into something that approximated compliance, while her hands, hidden in the folds of her gray dress, curled into fists so tight her knuckles ached. She would not cry. She had decided that before they'd ever put her up here. The way you decide to survive a winter, not with hope exactly, but with a kind of cold, grinding determination that leaves no room for alternatives. 3 times tonight, an alpha had approached the base of the platform and looked up at her. 3 times they had turned away. The first had been Garrett, middle-ranked, kind enough in passing, his retreat almost general, a shake of his head and an apologetic shrug to Aldrich, as if Wren were a coat that simply didn't fit. The second had been worse. Torvin, the beta alpha of the Eastern Ridge, a man with cold gray eyes and the kind of smile that never quite reached them, who had climbed halfway up the steps before stopping, before studying her with that measuring silence, and then saying, loudly enough for half the hall to hear, "Not even if you paid me to take her." She had not cried then either, but she remembered the exact temperature of the shame that moved through her. It was cold. It was precise. It lived in her sternum like a splinter of ice that refused to melt, no matter how many hours passed, no matter how many times she reminded herself that she did not want any of them. Not Garrett, not Torvin, not any of the wolves who had looked at her tonight like she was something to be weighed and discarded. The third alpha had not even bothered with her eyes, just one slow look from the base of the steps and then away. Now the hall was thinning. Couples had retired, families had followed. The elders at their long table conferred behind their hands with the humorless efficiency of men accounting a loss. Aldrich was climbing the steps again, and the expression on his face, somewhere between apology and resignation, told her everything she needed to know about what came next. There was a place, outside the village walls, where the unclaimed ones went. Not cruelty, the elders would say, simply practicality. She would be given 3 days' rations and pointed toward the road that led south, into the wildlands where wolves without packs disappeared like smoke. She had always known this might happen. She had told herself she was prepared. She was not prepared. The great doors at the far end of the hall opened, not with a creak, not with a polite knock. They opened the way storms arrive, all at once, with a pressure change that Wren felt behind her eyes before she heard anything at all. The remaining crowd went still. Aldrich froze mid-step. Even the torches seemed to hold their breath. And then she smelled it. Dark cedar and cold stone, and something that had no business being inside a building. Something that belonged to open ridgelines and moonless forests and the deep, lightless hours before dawn. Ancient, absolute, terrifyingly alive. She looked up, and every thought she had ever owned dissolved. He was not from Velhorn. That much was immediately, undeniably clear. Not from the cut of his clothes, though they were darker and finer than anything the village could produce, nor from the way he moved through the remaining crowd, which parted before him the way water parts before something too large and too certain to be argued with. It was clear because of what happened to the air when he entered it. Every alpha in the hall had gone quiet. Not the polite quiet of deference. The instinctive quiet of animals recognizing a predator at the top of a hierarchy so absolute it required no announcement. Wren watched, from her place on the platform, as Torvin, the same man who had made the hall laugh at her expense less than an hour ago, took one look at the figure in the doorway and stepped backward until a pillar stopped him. The stranger did not acknowledge any of it. He was tall, unreasonably, almost architecturally tall, with the kind of lean, controlled mass that suggested not a single pound of him existed without purpose. His hair was black, longer than fashion dictated, and his jaw was the sort of thing that looked like it had been carved by someone who took their work seriously. But none of that was what held her. What held her was his eyes. Even across the full length of the hall, even through the smoke and the wavering torchlight, she could see that they were pale. Silver, perhaps, or a gray so light it bordered on colorless. And they were moving across the hall with the calm, methodical precision of a man taking inventory of a place he already owned. They found the platform. They found her. And stopped. The world did not shake. No thunder split the ceiling, nothing so dramatic as that. It was quieter, and somehow more terrible. The way the bond announced itself not as a thunderclap, but as a key sliding into a lock she hadn't known existed in her chest, turning once, cleanly, with a soft and devastating click that she felt in the backs of her teeth and the hollows of her knees and every unprotected place in between. She could not look away. She was dimly aware of Aldrich descending the platform steps at speed, dimly aware of the elders rising from their table, of whispers multiplying through what remained of the crowd. She caught fragments. Kalen of the Ashford pack, the High Alpha himself? Why is he here? But the words reached her as if through deep water, slow and distorted, because he was still looking at her, and she was still looking at him, and the distance between them felt like a living thing, taut as a wire pulled to its limit. He moved, not toward the elders, who were already shuffling forward with their parchment and their protocol and their best approximations of authority. Not toward Aldrich, who had positioned himself at the base of the steps with the expression of a man who deeply regretted his profession. He moved toward the platform, directly, without hesitation, and the crowd folded away from his path, as if by reflex. He stopped at the base of the steps and looked up at her. Up close, he was worse. That was the only word for it. Worse. In the way that things that are extraordinarily beautiful are always somehow worse than you expected. Because beauty at that proximity becomes a kind of pressure. The scent of him hit her fully for the first time, and she felt her hands grip the fabric of her dress purely on instinct. Dark cedar and cold iron and something beneath both, something warm and deep and terrifyingly familiar, as though she had been dreaming of it for years without knowing what it was she was dreaming of. "What is your name?" It was not a question. His voice was low and even, the kind of voice that didn't need volume because the room had already gone quiet for it. She told herself to say nothing. She told herself to be sensible, to be cautious. to remember every single thing she knew about alphas who arrived uninvited with silver eyes and scents like the end of the world. "Ren," she said. Something moved across his face, too fast to name, gone before she could trace it. And then he turned to the elders with the unhurried certainty of a man who had never once in his life been told no, and had consequently no framework for the concept. "I'll take her." The silence that followed was a different kind than before. Stunned. Total. Even the torches seemed briefly confused. Aldrich made a sound that was not quite a word. One of the elders, old Harkin, who had run the sale for 30 years and had the face of a man who had seen everything, cleared his throat with the specific uncertainty of someone who had, in fact, not seen this. "My lord, the protocols require "I know the protocols." Kalen of Ashford reached into his coat, produced a coin pouch that landed on the elder's table with a weight that made the parchment jump, and looked at Ren again. And in his eyes, beneath the silver, beneath the impossible calm, she saw something that looked almost like relief. They gave her 10 minutes to collect her things. It was, in its own way, a mercy. 10 minutes meant she didn't have to stand on that platform any longer, didn't have to feel the weight of 24 stairs pressing against her back like thumbs. But it also meant 10 minutes was all she had to make sense of what had just happened. And 10 minutes was nowhere near enough. She moved through the narrow corridor behind the great hall on legs that functioned mostly out of habit, her small bundle of belongings tucked under one arm, a spare dress, a worn blanket, the little carved wooden bird her mother had left her, smooth from years of handling. Everything she owned fit in a cloth the size of a pillowcase. She had always told herself that was freedom. Tonight, it felt like evidence. Kalen of the Ashford Pack. She turned the name over as she walked. She knew it, of course. Everyone in the Northern Territories knew it, the way you know the names of storms and rivers and other things that shape the land without asking permission. The Ashford Pack was the oldest and largest in the region, its territory spanning 3 mountain ranges and 2 river valleys. Its alpha, a figure of the kind of authority that existed in stories told to children when adults wanted them to understand what power actually meant. She had never once imagined she would smell his scent. She had certainly never imagined it would do what it had done to her. That was the part she kept returning to, against her better judgment, in the brief and useless way you return to a flame after it's already burned you once. Not the fact of him, not the silver eyes or the coin purse or the stunned silence of the elders, but the feeling. The click. That impossible, involuntary, infuriating click of recognition that had moved through her the moment their eyes met, as if her body had received information her mind hadn't been consulted about. She didn't want a mate bond. She had decided that years ago, watching the sale from the outside, watching girls get chosen and led away and absorbed into someone else's life like drops of water into soil. She had decided she would rather disappear into the wildlands. She had decided she would rather be unclaimed and free and hungry than claimed and fed and owned. And then he had walked in. The side door opened before she reached it, and Kalen filled the frame. She stopped. Her bundle tightened under her arm. He was leaning against the door frame with his arms crossed, which should have looked casual, and instead looked like a deliberate choice to occupy as little space as possible. As if he was aware of the effect his full presence had, and was, in this specific moment, attempting to moderate it. He was watching her with that same silver-pale attention, steady and unreadable. "You were going to use the back passage," he said, not an accusation, an observation. "I was going to collect my things," she said, "which I have done." A pause. He looked at the bundle under her arm, the totality of her life, fitting neatly against her ribs, and something crossed his face that she refused to interpret. "My horses are at the eastern gate," he said. "We leave within the hour." "I haven't agreed to anything." The words came out steadier than she felt. She was proud of them. She watched him process them, watched the slight shift in his jaw, the fractional adjustment of his weight against the doorframe, and she understood, with a clarity that was almost funny, that he genuinely had not anticipated this response. "The coin has been paid," he said, carefully. "To the elders," she said, "not to me." She held his gaze because looking away felt like surrender, and she had survived too much tonight to surrender now. "I know what I smell between us. I'm not pretending I don't. But I'm also not a purse that changes hands, my lord. And if that's what you came here expecting, then I think you should ask for your coin back." The silence that followed was long enough that she started to wonder if she had made a catastrophic error in judgment. And then, slowly, something shifted at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, something more reluctant than a smile, and more genuine for it. "The bond doesn't frighten you." "Everything about you frightens me," she said with complete honesty. "I'm simply not letting it make my decisions." He looked at her for a moment that stretched and stretched, the torchlight catching the pale of his eyes and turning them briefly, startlingly gold. Then he pushed off the door frame and turned toward the eastern gate, not waiting, not beckoning, simply moving, as if the direction of travel was already decided, and the only remaining question was whether she would be sensible about it. "You want the cloak from the second saddlebag," he said, over his shoulder. "It gets cold on the ridge road after midnight." She stood in the corridor for 3 full seconds, her bundle under her arm, hating him mildly. Then she followed. Because the bond hummed warm and certain in her chest with every step she took toward him, and the wild lands to the south were very cold. And she had never once in her life been able to outrun something true. The ridge road was exactly as cold as he had promised. Wren rode wrapped in the cloak from the second saddlebag. Dark wool, heavy, smelling of cedar and iron and him, which she was doing her absolute best not to think about, and watched the forest close around them as Velhorn's distant torchlight disappeared behind the tree line. The night was deep and moonless, the kind of dark that had weight to it, and the only sounds were the horses' steady rhythm against the frozen earth and the occasional distant call of something wild in the trees. Halen rode ahead, not far ahead, perhaps 2 horse lengths, but with a consistency that told her the distance was deliberate. He had not spoken since the eastern gate. He had helped her mount with one brief, impersonal touch at her elbow, and the contact had lasted less than a second, and she had felt it in her shoulder for the following 10 minutes, like a coal pressed gently against skin. She was beginning to understand that the bond was going to be a problem, not in the abstract way she had always understood it could be. She had grown up on stories of mates who burned for each other across distances, who sickened when separated, who were remade by the connection into something that hardly resembled the people they had been before. She had filed those stories under reasons to be cautious and moved on. But now, with 2 horse lengths of cold night air between them, she felt the bond as a physical thing, a warmth in her sternum that oriented toward him the way a compass needle orients north, and pulled, gently but insistently, with every yard she did not close. She gritted her teeth and maintained the distance. After another mile, he spoke. "You grew up in Velhorn." Not a question again. She was beginning to suspect he used statements the way other people used questions. Safer, perhaps, for a man who didn't want to appear to need answers. "Since I was 4, she said. "My mother brought us there when my father's pack disbanded." A pause. Disbanded. "Scattered." She kept her voice even. "There was a territorial claim, a larger pack. The kind of thing that happens when a pack has no alpha strong enough to hold the boundary." She paused. "My mother didn't survive the following winter." She did not know why she told him that last part. She hadn't planned to. The words had simply come, pulled out by the same infuriating current that kept drawing her eyes to the line of his shoulders against the dark. He didn't offer condolence, which she appreciated. He simply let the information settle, and when he spoke again, his voice was a degree quieter. "How long have you known about your scent?" The question, and it was a question this time, she noticed, landed in her chest with a small, precise ache. "Always," she said. "The elder woman said it was because my mother had mixed blood somewhere in her line, something that isn't quite wolf." She adjusted the cloak around her shoulders. It made me difficult to place, too strange for the pack to fully accept, too wolf to be considered human. A beat. Apparently, it also makes me difficult to mate. Not difficult, he said, specific. She looked at the back of his head. Is that what it is? He turned his face slightly, not enough to look at her fully, just enough that she caught his profile against the darkness, the clean, hard angle of his jaw, the way he seemed to be choosing his next words with unusual care. What you carry in your scent is old, he said, older than most wolves can recognize. The ones who turned away tonight weren't rejecting you. A pause, weighted and deliberate. They were afraid of you. The silence that followed was broken only by the horses and the cold. Wren turned that over for a long moment, examining it the way you examine something you're not sure is a gift or a trap. She did not get the chance to respond. From the trees to the left of the road, close, far too close, came a sound that wasn't wind and wasn't animal. The specific cracking of undergrowth disturbed by something moving with speed and intention rather than accident. Kaylin's horse stopped instantly. His hand went up, a sharp gesture that arrested her own horse mid-step. The forest went very quiet, and then she smelled it. Beneath the cedar and the cold, beneath the clean, dark scent of Kaylin's presence, something rotten and acrid and deeply wrong. The smell of old aggression and fresh hunger. The smell of wolves who had been running hard and were not running away from something. They were running toward it. Kaylin turned to look at her fully for the first time since they'd left Velhorn, and his eyes in the darkness were not silver anymore. They were gold. Lit from within, burning with the particular light of an alpha whose wolf had surfaced completely. Fast and total and without the usual effort such transitions required. His voice when he spoke was still controlled, but underneath the control was something vast and barely leashed. Stay on the horse. Whatever happens, stay on the horse and don't touch the ground. She wanted to argue. The part of her that had kept herself alive for 20 years on sheer stubbornness wanted to ask why. Wanted to demand information, wanted to refuse any instruction that arrived without explanation. But the smell from the trees was getting closer, and the look in his eyes was not the look of a man being cautious. It was the look of a man who recognized what was coming, and was already deciding how many of them he could take before one got past him. They came from 3 directions at once. That was the first thing she registered. Not the number of them, not their size, but the coordination, the deliberate triangulation of approach that spoke of planning rather than opportunistic hunger. These were not feral wolves acting on instinct. These were wolves following instructions. Kaylin was off his horse before the first one cleared the tree line. The transformation was not what the stories described. The stories made it sound like violence, like something being torn apart and rebuilt against its will. What she witnessed was closer to inevitability, the way a river becomes the sea, continuous and total, his human form simply ceasing to be the most relevant version of him as the great black wolf took its place. He was enormous. Even braced on her horse, her hands white-knuckled in the mane, she felt the breath leave her at the sheer size of him. Dark as the forest itself, his shoulders reaching a height that should have been impossible. His gold eyes burning in the dark like 2 low coals. He hit the first wolf before it had fully emerged from the tree line. She stayed on the horse. She had decided to stay on the horse. But the horse had opinions of its own about the situation, and those opinions involved a great deal of sideways movement and one genuinely alarming rear that nearly unseated her before she found her grip and pressed her knees in hard and spoke low and continuous into the animal's flattened ear. Easy, easy, I know, stay. Her own heartbeat a counterpoint to everything happening in the darkness around her. 3 wolves, then a 4th emerging from the right flank. Kaylin moved through them like weather. It was brutal, and it was efficient, and it was over faster than her mind could fully follow. A a sequence of impact and snarl, and the specific silence that follows decisive force. And then there was only the black wolf standing at the center of the road, chest heaving, golden eyes sweeping the tree line with the focused attention of a predator, confirming there was nothing left to address. When he turned back to her, the wolf was already receding. He dressed without acknowledgement of the process, something she carefully did not watch. And by the time he approached her horse, he was simply himself again. Human-shaped, at least, though his jaw was set in a way that told her the wolf was still close beneath the surface. He looked up at her. A cut above his left brow was bleeding in a thin, dark line. She acted before she thought. That was the honest accounting of what happened. Her hand was already reaching, already pulling the hem of her underdress from beneath the cloak, already tearing a strip from the linen before her better judgment had been consulted on the matter. "Hold still." He looked at the strip of fabric in her hand. He looked at her face. He held still. She pressed the cloth to the cut and felt his exhale. Slow, controlled, the breath of a man applying significant effort to a simple physical response, and she was close enough now to see the way his jaw tightened, close enough that his scent surrounded her completely, and the bond flared warm and urgent in her chest like a struck bell. She focused on the cut. "Those wolves," she said, keeping her voice practical. "They weren't random." No. His voice was lower than usual. She told herself that was because she was close, not because of the cloth against his skin. "They wear Torvin's scent mark." She went still. "Torvin sent wolves to attack us on the road. Torvin sent wolves to take you back." A pause. "Or ensure you didn't arrive at Ashford." She absorbed that. Torvin, the man who had publicly humiliated her, who had looked at her like she was worth nothing, had cared enough about where she ended up to send 4 wolves into the dark after her. The contradiction was almost offensive. "He didn't want me," she said. "He just doesn't want anyone else to have me either." "That is a very common kind of wanting," Kaylin said. She looked at him then, which was a mistake, because he was already looking at her, and the distance between their faces was not the distance she had been managing carefully since Velhorn. It was the distance of tending a wound, of necessity and care, of her hand still pressed against his temple and his breath moving against her cheek in the cold night air. She stepped back. The bond protested with the pull she felt from her sternum to her knees. "You should have told me there was a threat," she said, "before we left." "I didn't know the threat would move this quickly." "That's not the same as telling me." He regarded her with those pale eyes, the gold entirely gone now, and said nothing for a moment that lasted precisely long enough to feel like an answer. "You're right," he said finally. "I should have told you." She had not expected that. The simple directness of it moved through her defenses like water through cracked stone, quiet and unstoppable, and she had to look away and pretend to check the horse's bridle to give herself a moment to reconstruct them. "How much farther to Ashford?" she asked. "Half a night's ride," he remounted. "We should move. There may be more." She remounted without assistance, a small and probably petty assertion of independence, and they rode on through the dark, closer together this time, the deliberate 2-horse-length distance quietly abandoned somewhere between the wolves and the strip of linen still pressed against his skin. She told herself it was only practical. She told herself a great many things that night that the bond, warm and patient and absolutely certain in her chest, did not bother to argue with. Because it knew, as she was slowly beginning to know, that it did not need to hurry. It had already won. Ashford was not what she had imagined. She had built it in her mind as something severe, all stone and dominance, a place designed to remind you of your smallness the moment you pass through its gates. What she found instead, as dawn broke gray and cold over the ridge, was something that looked almost like a village that had simply grown too large and too permanent to be called one. Timber and stone in equal measure, smoke rising from a dozen hearths, the smell of bread and pine resin, and the particular warm animal scent of a large pack living in close proximity. People stopped to watch them arrive. She felt their eyes, the way she always felt collective attention, like weather, like something you endure rather than enjoy. But these stares were different from Velhorn's, not cruel, assessing. And beneath the assessment, something she couldn't immediately name. She named it 3 steps into the main yard, when a woman of middle age with iron gray hair and the bearing of someone who had never once doubted her right to occupy space stepped forward and looked at Ren with an expression that was not welcome exactly, but was not hostility either. It was recognition. "So it's true," the woman said. Her name, Ren would learn, was Margot, Kalen's second, his pack's authority in all things domestic and political. "You found her." "She found herself," Kalen said, dismounting. "I simply provided transport." Margot looked at Ren for a long moment. Then, with the brisk efficiency of someone who had decided a thing and saw no reason to delay acting on it, she said, "You'll need a bath, a meal, and 12 hours of sleep, in that order. The Pack Council meets at sundown." "The Council wants to assess you." Margot's voice was not unkind, but it left no room for negotiation. An alpha arriving from the mating sale with an unclaimed omega of unknown bloodline is not a small thing, girl. They will have questions. Ren looked at Kalen. He was already looking at her, and the expression on his face was the one she was beginning to recognize as his version of apology. Not performed, not verbal, just a slight tightening around the eyes that acknowledged an inconvenience he hadn't protected her from. "I'll be present at the council," he said. To her, not to Margot. It was not a reassurance. It was a declaration. She understood the difference, and the bond understood it too, flaring briefly warm before she pressed it back down. She followed Margot inside. The hours that followed were disorienting in their normalcy. Hot water, plain food, a room with a real bed and a window that looked out over the eastern tree line. She slept without meaning to, deeply and without dreams, and woke to the specific quality of late afternoon light and the sound of the pack moving through its routines below. The council was 12 wolves, seated in a long room lit by wall-mounted torches, and they looked at her the way the elders of Velhorn had looked at the coin purse, as a matter to be decided. The questions were careful and numerous. Her bloodline, her mother's pack, her training, her abilities, the nature of her scent. She answered each one honestly because she had never found deception to be worth the maintenance, and watched them process her answers with varying degrees of acceptance. It was the last question that broke something open. An older male, broad and gray-templed, leaned forward with the deliberate weight of someone delivering the real point after a long preamble. "Do you accept the bond?" The room went very still. She felt Kalen beside her, not touching, but present, his warmth a solid fact at her left shoulder. And she felt the bond respond to the question as if it too were waiting. That warm, impossible compass pole going quiet and attentive in her chest. She thought about the platform, about the cold and the duration, and Torvin's laugh and 3 days' rations and the road south into the wild lands. She thought about cedar and cold iron and a cloak that smelled like safety she hadn't asked for. She thought about specific and what it meant to be told your strangeness was not damage, but precision. "I haven't decided yet," she said. The older male blinked. Beside her she heard, barely, almost nothing, the quiet exhale of a man releasing breath he had been holding for a very long time. She didn't look at Kalen, but her hand, resting on the table between them, shifted 1 inch to the left. And his little finger touched hers, and neither of them moved away. 3 days passed before Torvin made his next move. Ren spent them learning Ashford the way she had learned every place she had ever lived, carefully, from the edges inward, mapping exits before she mapped entrances. She learned the bakehouse opened before dawn. She learned the pack's juveniles trained in the western yard each morning and that their noise was a reliable clock. She learned that Kalen rose earlier than anyone and spent the first hour of daylight alone at the tree line, still and watchful, like a man standing guard against something only he could see. She learned that without trying to learn it. That was the bond's particular cruelty. It fed her information about him whether she wanted it or not. The low-level awareness of his location at any given moment, the way her sleep deepened when he was in the same building, the The way food tasted slightly more like food when he sat across the table, which was an absurd and deeply inconvenient thing to notice. On the third morning, Margot found her in the bakehouse before sunrise and sat across from her with 2 cups of something hot and the expression of a woman who had decided it was time for a different kind of conversation. "You know what you are," Margot said, not a question. Wren wrapped her hands around the cup. "I know what I'm not." "That's not the same thing." Margot studied her with those direct, iron-gray eyes. "Your mother never told you about her bloodline." "She died before she could tell me much of anything." A pause. Margot set down her cup. "Your scent," she said carefully, "carries the mark of the Varen line. An old bloodline, older than most packs can trace. They were not purely shifters." She let that settle. They were something that came before shifters. Something the old texts call anchor. Wren went very still. "What does that mean?" "It means you don't just carry a bond," Margot said. "You ground it. An alpha bonded to a Varen anchor doesn't just gain a mate. He gains stability, clarity, the kind of centered power that makes a pack unshakable." She paused. "It also means any alpha who understood what you were and didn't want Kaelin to have it would have very good reason to want you gone." The wolves on the road, Torvin's scent mark, everything rearranged itself in Wren's mind with a cold, clarifying click. She was still sitting with that when the warning bell rang. It was a single hard toll, the pack signal for a hostile approach at the boundary, and the bakehouse emptied in seconds. By the time Wren reached the main yard, Ashford was already in motion, wolves moving to positions with the practiced efficiency of a pack that had defended its territory before and expected to do so again. Kaelin was at the gate. He turned when she approached, and the look on his face stopped her 3 steps away. Not the controlled unreadability she had grown used to, but something raw, something that sat closer to the surface than he usually allowed. "Go back inside." "Tell me what's happening." "Wren, tell me!" A muscle moved in his jaw. "Torvin has come with a formal challenge. 40 wolves at the southern boundary." His voice was even, but his eyes were gold again, fully, without the silver she had come to associate with his human patience. "He's claiming you were taken from Velhorn under false pretense, that the bond is manufactured, that I used Ashford's influence to steal an Omega that wasn't mine to claim." The injustice of it moved through her like heat. "That's not—" "I know. Quiet, absolute. But a formal challenge has to be answered formally, which means I have to meet him at the boundary." He looked at her, and beneath the gold, beneath the alpha and the power and the impossible self-possession, she saw the thing she had glimpsed only once before, in the great hall, when he had looked at her from across the room for the first time. Relief, she had called it then. She understood now that she had named it wrong. It was fear. The specific, devastating fear of someone who had found the thing they didn't know they were looking for, and was now being asked to risk losing it. Her hand moved before her mind approved the action. She pressed her palm flat against his chest, feeling the steady, too fast beat of his heart beneath her fingers, and looked up at him. "Come back," she said. His hand covered hers, just for a moment, just long enough. Then he walked toward the boundary, and she stood in the yard of Ashford with her palm still warm. And finally, with complete and terrifying certainty, she made her decision. She did not go back inside. Margot found her at the eastern wall, where the timber was old enough to have footholds worn into it by years of juveniles climbing where they weren't supposed to. And to her credit, Margot did not try to stop her. She simply climbed up beside her, and they stood together on the narrow ledge, looking south toward the boundary where 2 forces had assembled in the gray morning light. Torvin had brought more than 40. She could see them from here, a dark mass at the tree's edge, spread wide, the particular stillness of wolves holding a line. Kaelin stood at Ashford's boundary marker with a dozen of his own, and even from this distance, even without the bond's insistent hum pointing her toward him like a compass, she could identify him by the way the space around him organized itself. The negotiation, if it could be called that, lasted less than 10 minutes. She couldn't hear the words. She didn't need to. She could read the shape of the exchange and the posture of the men. Torvin's aggressive forward lean, the two wolves flanking him moving incrementally closer. Kalen's absolute stillness in response. The kind of stillness that was not passivity but its precise opposite. Then Torvin pointed directly at the wall where she stood. Every head in both groups turned. She felt the collective attention land on her like a physical weight, and she straightened her spine against it because she had been looked at like a problem to be solved for 20 years, and she was tired of shrinking in response. Kalen turned too. Even across the distance, she saw the moment he registered her on the wall, the slight tension in his shoulders, the fractional pause, and then he turned back to Torvin and said something short and final that she felt in her chest before she heard it carry on the wind. Torvin's response was to shift. It happened fast after that. Torvin's wolves moving forward as Kalen's line braced, and Ren was off the wall before she had consciously decided to move, Margot's hand catching her arm and missing. Girl. But she was already through the gate. She understood, distantly, that this was probably unwise. She understood it the way you understand weather when you're already standing in it. But the bond was a roar in her chest now, no longer the gentle compass pull of the past 3 days, but something total and directional. And beneath it was something else, something that rose from a place deeper than the bond, deeper than want or fear or any of the ordinary human motivation she had spent her life navigating. Something that felt ancient, something that felt like her. She walked through the gap between the two forces, and everything stopped. Not because of what she was, not yet, but because she walked the way her mother had once described Varen women walking, like the ground belonged to them, like the air had agreed to move around them rather than requiring them to push through it. And whatever that quality was, it worked on wolves the way open water works on a fire. Torvin stared at her, half shifted, jaw distorted, eyes burning feral amber. Go back to the wall, Omega. No, she said pleasantly. She felt Kalen close behind her, not touching, but there, his warmth a wall at her back, the bond between them suddenly so bright and clear it was almost visible. She looked at Torvin and let the thing inside her, the old thing, the Varen thing she had spent her entire life pressing down because she hadn't known what it was or why it frightened people. She let it surface. The effect was subtle and total. A shift in her scent, expanding outward like a stone dropped in still water, carrying something that was not threat and was not submission, but was something older than either. The particular quality of bedrock, of deep roots, of a thing that cannot be moved because it is not standing somewhere but has grown there. Torvin's wolves stepped back, not in deference, in instinct. Torvin himself wavered. She watched it happen. Watched the feral amber in his eyes cloud with something that looked, briefly, like the same confused awe she had seen on the elders' faces in Velhorn. Then it curdled into rage. He lunged. And Kalen moved, past her, in front of her, and the black wolf rose. And the sound that left him was not a growl. It was a declaration. It was over in less time than it had taken Torvin to start it. The black wolf was faster than anything that size had a right to be, faster than logic, faster than Torvin's rage, which had carried him 3 steps before Kalen met him and the impact shook the ground like a dropped stone. She felt it through her feet. She felt it through the bond, a shockwave of force and focus that moved through her chest like a bell struck from the inside. Torvin's wolves did not advance. She understood why. What stood between her and them was not merely an alpha defending his territory. It was something categorical, something that rewrote the terms of the encounter, simply by being fully, completely itself. The black wolf did not fight with anger. It fought with the cold, total precision of a thing that had been powerful long enough to stop needing to perform it. When it was finished, Torvin lay at the boundary marker, breathing but finished, and his wolves were retreating into the tree line with their tails low and their eyes averted. The black wolf stood over him for a moment that needed no translation, and then it turned and looked at her. Gold eyes. Her cedar and iron scent recognition. the bond between them incandescent now, not a hum, but a full and resonant tone, the kind of sound that lives in the body rather than the ears. The wolf padded toward her. She did not step back. It stopped close. Closer than was comfortable, closer than was safe by any ordinary measure, and she felt its breath against her face, warm and steady, carrying his scent so concentrated it was nearly overwhelming. She felt the Varen thing in her responding to it, the deep roots quality of her own nature reaching toward his like two river systems finding their confluence. She raised her hand. She pressed her palm to the side of the wolf's jaw, feeling the coarse warmth of his fur, the solid reality of him beneath her fingers, and she said, quietly, with the certainty of someone who has crossed the distance between a decision and its enactment and found solid ground on the other side, I accept the bond. The effect was immediate and total. The light changed. That was the only way she could describe it afterward. The morning light shifted, as if the world had taken a breath and let it out differently. And the warmth that moved through the bond was no longer the careful, restrained thing it had been for 3 days, but something full. Something that filled every cold place she had carried since she was 4 years old and her mother had not survived the winter. The wolf shimmered, reformed. Kaelin knelt on one knee at her feet, human again, breathing hard, and when he looked up at her, his eyes were silver and gold together, both at once, shifting, and the expression on his face was the most unguarded thing she had ever seen on another person. She had not known it was possible for someone like him to look like that, like relief and terror and arrival all at once. She dropped to her knees in front of him, without caring that the ground was cold, or that 40 wolves had just watched Torvin's retreat, or that Margot was certainly observing all of this from the wall with an expression she would have opinions about later. His hands came up and cupped her face. Careful, the way you hold something you've been afraid of breaking. And she felt the bond complete itself between them, like a circuit finally closed, warm and absolute and entirely, undeniably real. I looked for you, he said. His voice was rough at the edges in a way she had never heard before. For years. I didn't know what I was looking for. She understood that. She had spent 20 years not knowing what she was waiting for either, standing at the cold edge of crowds, filing herself under too strange and not quite right, and something is wrong with her. Specific, she said. Something broke open in his expression. He pressed his forehead to hers, and she closed her eyes, and the winter morning was very cold around them and completely irrelevant. Behind them, from the direction of Ashford's walls, came the sound of the pack, not performing celebration, simply unable to contain it. She felt it move through her like warmth through cold stone. Slow, total, permanent. And for the first time in her life, standing in the frost at the boundary of a place that had not yet decided to be hers, she felt, with every quiet and certain part of her, that she had finally arrived somewhere she was meant to be. Spring came to Ashford like an exhale. Wren noticed it first in the mornings. The way the light arrived earlier each day, warmer and less tentative, spreading across the eastern wall in long gold sheets that turned the frost to vapor before the bakehouse had finished its first loaves. She noticed it in the pack's juveniles, who abandoned their winter discipline and spilled into the western yard with a noise and energy that had been absent for months. She noticed it in the tree line, where the dark skeletons of the winter forest were beginning, tentatively, to suggest they had other intentions. She noticed it in herself, too, though that was harder to name. It was Margot who named it for her, one morning over the now familiar ritual of 2 cups of something hot, with the directness that Wren had come to understand was the older woman's primary love language. "You've stopped mapping the exits," Margot said. Wren looked up. "When you arrived," Margot continued, with the serenity of someone delivering an observation they've been holding for months, "you learned every door in this building within the first 2 days. I watched you do it." A pause. "You haven't checked the eastern corridor in 3 weeks." Wren considered denying it. She found she didn't want to. "I suppose I have," she said, and the simplicity of it, the quiet, unremarkable truth of it, settled in her chest like the first warm morning after a long winter. She belonged here, not because she had been claimed, not because the bond had declared it and her biology had agreed, but because she had chosen it. Had chosen it on her knees in the frost, at the boundary, with her eyes open and her history intact, and every reason to be cautious still present and accounted for. She had chosen him, and the choosing had made it hers, in a way that no sale, no coin purse, no formal council declaration could have manufactured. The council had named her Luna of Ashford 6 weeks after the boundary confrontation, in a ceremony that Wren had endured with the stoic patience of someone who found ceremony mostly unnecessary but understood its function. Kalen had stood beside her with his hand at the small of her back, warm, steady, present. And when the pack had turned to face her, as their Luna for the first time, she had not felt the old instinct to step back, to make herself smaller, to apologize for taking up space. She had stood still and let herself be seen. That had been its own kind of threshold. Now she stood at the eastern window of the room that had become theirs. The room with the view over the tree line. The room with the real bed that she had fallen asleep in that first morning without meaning to, and watched the pack move through its morning routines in the yard below. With the particular quality of attention she had discovered in herself since the bond completed. Not watchfulness exactly, more like belonging, the warm awareness of a person who has a stake in what they're observing. Arms came around her from behind, familiar now, the cedar and iron of him, the solid warmth, and she leaned back without thinking, the way you lean into something you've stopped being surprised by. "Margot wants you at the Eastern Settlement meeting this afternoon," Kalen said against her hair. "I know," she left a note. A pause. She always leaves a note. She felt the quiet resonance of his amusement more than she heard it. They stood like that for a moment in the new spring light, the pack moving below them, the tree line going green at its edges, the bond between them a steady and familiar warmth that no longer felt like a compass pulling her somewhere she hadn't arrived yet. It felt like home. She turned in his arms and looked up at him, at the silver eyes that had stopped the world the first time she'd seen them across a torchlit hall full of people who had decided she wasn't worth choosing. And she thought, not for the first time, and not with any particular drama, that the elders of Velhorn had done her the greatest accidental kindness of her life by leaving her on that platform long enough. Long enough for the right door to open. "The meeting isn't until afternoon," she said. Something shifted in his expression. That reluctant, genuine, almost smile that she had decided was her favorite thing she had ever seen. "No," he agreed. "It isn't." Outside, the spring light moved across Ashford like a blessing. And inside, for the first time in 20 years, Wren did not think about exits.